Well, it's great to be here. I think I was here about a year ago, and so I'd say welcome to everyone in the audience here and also the people who are online. So it's a great pleasure to do this. So as John was saying, I do walking tours of the San Francisco City Guides and the Historical Society, and I know quite a bit about the earthquake and fire, so hopefully you'll enjoy, be entertained by what I have to say. And tonight I was going to focus in on the heroes of the San Francisco earthquake and fire. I spent most of my time worried about the body of this presentation, and I forgot to have some illustrious picture or photograph up here, so hopefully you bear with me and it'll get better with time because it looks pretty dull here. But what I wanted to do is just go through this agenda, so to speak, or the items, which initially I wanted to just give you a sense of what it was like. Many of you people probably know or have a fair bit of knowledge about the earthquake and fire, but to understand the conditions under which people found themselves, right? We had one day an earthquake and then 3 days of fire. Very significant, most significant natural disaster to be imparted to any U.S. city. So with that being done, we'll move on and highlight some of these heroes. And clearly there's many more, and I just selected a variety that will provide illustration of the range of people that were involved and who got involved and put themselves at risk for the betterment of the city. So let's go to the next slide. And clearly some of these may be familiar, from the Mechanics Pavilion to the main post office and on, but let's go through them. So in terms of the conditions or the setting, before I show you some photographs of the devastation to San Francisco, I just wanted to kind of give you a feeling, and I'm not trying to cover everything here, but the conditions in terms of the perspective that you may know that General Funston took a very leading role. He was second in command at the Presidio. The leading general was actually away in Chicago for a wedding for his daughter, and his perspective is a little bit different, and it kind of pervades how the city responds. In essence, it's fairly straightforward. They're saving the city from the people versus saving the people. He was very concerned about anarchy and people running amok and not behaving properly. And there was some of that, but not really a lot. I hope I'll impress upon you that San Franciscans, like many people during disasters, behave in a very courteous way. And there is a book by Rebecca Solnit, who's a local author, which really expounds on this thesis. And I'll just also point out that because of a number of reasons, there was a lot of mismanagement and fractured leadership. It was poorly managed in terms of managing a disaster. I mean, it's pretty hard to actually plan for a disaster and know exactly what to do, but this was how not to do it. And Dennis Sullivan, who was a pretty important individual, he actually is mortally wounded day one and dies 4 days later, okay? So he was probably the most critical individual, and he is literally decapitated, in terms of managing this disaster. So it's really, they're starting from a hole, so to speak. And also there was an understatement. You know well aware, probably historically, that they used explosives to create fire breaks, and they didn't do that too well, okay? And I'll talk a little bit about that. And there was also a very early issuance of a shoot-to-kill order by the mayor. So that's posted, I think, by the afternoon of day one, without any true observations of extensive looting and all this kind of thing. But if you were not responding to the military that was in town, because there was in excess of 2,000 military personnel at the orders of Funston, who wanted to provide supporting services to the first responders, but he takes a more commanding role, in fact. But there's a shoot-to-kill order, and also post-event, the city made a great effort to refer to it as the Great Fire, as opposed to the earthquake and fire. So there was a concerted and deliberate effort to downplay the magnitude and type event this was. People didn't know how to deal with earthquakes. There was no earthquake insurance. There was fire insurance and such. LA had advertised itself after this event as being earthquake-free. So we know that that's not true now. And also, again, to that same purpose of downplaying the event, the city of San Francisco, the death toll is revised and revised and revised, and it's not until recently, in the last 20, 30 years, that through the efforts of one individual, Gladys Hansen, that the numbers have exceeded 3,000 people, okay? So that's kind of the beginning of the backdrop, and I'll just talk first about Dennis Sullivan, which you can see him, typical portrait of the time. He was highly regarded, and just some of the bullets below him, he actually was quite in tune with the risks that San Francisco had with its very, very tight housing, lots of use of wood and such. And he also realized that there was an inadequate water supply by the Spring Valley Water Company, right? They don't go away until the early 30s and such, but and he also advocated for explosive experts. So he was really ahead of the game, never got this kind of funding that he needed for this, and he also was in favor of an auxiliary water supply, which you can maybe ask me a question at the end, but in essence, there is a high-pressure, gravity-fed water system that is in San Francisco that compares to no other around the world in terms of its extent and magnitude, and that is a result of the actual earthquake and fire. So he was supportive of that, but here he is, he returns to his firehouse on Bush, and the California Hotel is nearby. He returns there at 3 o'clock in the morning that was his residence. There was a fire that evening at the cannery down by the foot of Van Ness, and people don't return because there are many engine companies that are at this fire. He doesn't return till like 3 in the morning. His wife is sleeping in the front room and he's sleeping in the rear room, and you know what's going to happen to those turrets and those chimneys there. They have a propensity to calve off or break, right? And so they actually, excuse me, they fall through the center of the firehouse. And, we don't know the details, but he valiantly approaches his wife's bedroom to see how her welfare is, and he falls into the gaping hole that is in the center of the building, and him and his wife end up in the basement. He's mortally wounded, has severe burns, and he dies 4 days later. She is fine. She's moved to the California Hotel, and she survives without much injury, and he moves to the Southern Pacific Company Hospital, which is 14th and Mission, and then he's moved to the Presidio Hospital, but he doesn't make it. So clearly, with his importance and such, he's kind of removed from the equation from the very beginning. And here's just a cartoon image illustration. By 9 o'clock, explosives are delivered to Portsmouth Square in front of where City Hall was, not far from here. And most of the explosives that are delivered are black gunpowder. They also use dynamite, but black gunpowder is not so hot because it actually creates fires. Getting back to the, having people on staff that are knowledgeable of using explosives, that was not available at the time. But they got better in time because they had 3 days to practice. And that arrives by 9 o'clock. At 9 o'clock, actually, there's 48 barrels of gunpowder that actually arrives at Portsmouth Square. And let's see what I got here. So one of the directives from the mayor, who doesn't know anything about explosives and creating fire breaks, is that you do not blow up a building until it is either on fire or the adjacent building is on fire. which is kind of a little bit too late, in fact. Because in fact, using gunpowder blows up the building and actually creates fires and embers, and there's no water because we know all or most of the water lines are actually severed. There were some places where there was water, and that, you know. And then this other guy, Birmingham, he is the president of the California Powder Works, and he advertises himself as an explosive expert. The only problem is he's drunk, severely drunk, and the military doesn't want to have anything to do with him. But for whatever reason, I don't know the details, but he actually has his own entourage, and he is blowing up buildings in the North Beach and Chinatown area, and he's responsible for 60 fires. And here's the shoot to kill order, which was posted by the afternoon of day one. Okay, and you know, there's some reports have, you know, 30 or 40. I don't think the numbers are really clear, but there are many stories of individuals who are not listening to orders from the military, are shot, or people who are looting, and there were military personnel looting too. So, but in terms of the dominance of looting, I think it's really a minimal issue, but this was the directive. And I just want to go through a couple of images that kind of show you the intensity of the fire, and then we'll move into the stories about some of these heroes and what their boundary conditions were and how they actually saved this building or that building from being consumed by fire. And here you can see a horseless, because these are horse-drawn, steam-powered engines. A lot of horses actually bolted because they were agitated as soon as they opened up the doors. And this is 5:12 in the morning, April 18th. I covered some of this in my last year's talk, and I don't want to be too repetitious, but and you can see the Call building, which is the tallest building at the time, or the Spreckles Tower at the corner of 3rd and Market. It's burning like a Roman candle. The building survived, you know, admirably. One of the architects was a bridge engineer, so the building had minimal damage, but, you know, fire is fire, and it has ways to get in through windows. This actually gets in through an adjacent building through a shaft, and then goes up the elevator shaft. And so these are pretty poor images, but to me they really, you know, they speak of a furnace. You know, they speak of the heat, which is like over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and you know, some of the descriptions are similar to the firebombing during World War II, you know, in Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, and such. And here's kind of after the fact. You can see a number of buildings that are designated with Powell Street, the Fairmont in the background and such. So the downtown is devastated. I mean, the 75% of the city is consumed by fire. And here, once it gets west of the business district, you can see it levels everything, because all you have are wooden homes, and all you see is the network of streets. And you can see, I'm going to talk a little bit about, or I will talk about, City Hall and the post office, and the ham and eggs fire, which is notorious. There's a recent book by Davenport, which you may have seen, The Longest Minute, and he argues that ham and eggs fire is really kind of a bit of a myth, but I still left it with just in quotes. So let's move on. So this is kind of a map showing the fire and the path that they took in the burn district, and you can clearly see, maybe not from this map, but this area south of Market, which is really where the most significant clusters of fires were, and then also in this Yerba Buena Cove area that used to be Yerba Buena Cove but was filled in. So the areas that had fill, either made ground by the municipality dumping primarily sand to expand the footprint of the city, or natural fill through, think of lagoons, tidal channels, and streams flowing down to the bay, and there was a major fairway through here called Hayes Valley, okay? And it was those areas where the fire started. So moving on, I wanted to just read this quote to you. It's by Cooper, and he was considered probably the most eloquent of the people who wrote about the earthquake and fire. Jack London was in town, but he, passed the baton to Cooper as being the most eloquent. And I'll quickly try to read it. All night the city burned with a copper glow, and all night the dynamite of the firefighters, which starts at 9 in the morning and continue reverberating throughout the city for several days, boomed at slow intervals, which is the pulse of the great city in its agony. Nob Hill, the Fairmont, the homes of the pioneer millionaires, Mark Hopkins with its art treasures were aglow, a ruby tiara upon the city. And before the irresistible advance, the people were fleeing, tens and thousands of refugees toward the sea and open spaces. And for the third time, the headquarters of government had been changed, this time to the North End police station, and by 11 o'clock that was in danger, and another exodus was made to Franklin Hall on Fillmore Street, once suburb, now center. So there was this continual progression of people having to relocate as the fire progressed and progressed and progressed. And I walked down Market Street late in the afternoon on the second day. It was as if I walked through a dead city, not a city recently dead, but one overcome by some cataclysm ages past and dug out of its lava. Fragments of walls rose on all sides, columns twisted but solid in their warp, as if petrified in the midst of their writhing from the fiery ordeal. Across them a yellow smoke passed slowly, and above all a heavy, brooding silence. And really, there was nothing else. Contortion of stone, smoke, destruction, and a great silence, that was all. I mean, it was an incredible event that I think is captured there. This is a map that just shows the 3 days. You can see Market Street in red, and you can see the old shoreline in blue. Right? Remember we talked about fill and the susceptibility of those areas that Hayes Valley was in through here. Okay, and you can see the 3 days, yellow, red, and blue being the third day. So, and these are the areas I'm going to talk about. So the waterfront, and the stars just, the stars just show the position. This would be for the waterfront, and all these images, the waterfront is saved, and that's through serious efforts by Freeman. The Mechanics Pavilion and the San Francisco Mint and the main post office are these three clusters in through here, and I'll talk about them. And then Lu Hing, who is a very wealthy entrepreneur in Chinatown, is depicted here. And Stetson, who is a very upper crust president of a rail company, gives a very detailed, accurate report of his wanderings for those 3 days. And I think he does something that, in my mind, is heroic, but at the same time, you may not think so, though we'll talk about it a little bit. His position is right there in that notch. This is Van Ness Boulevard here. And then the fourth one, the last one is depicted by, this is Jefferson Square, which denotes parks. And that's the San Francisco citizenry. And how did they respond? Okay, any comments or questions? We're okay? So let's just go on to Navy Lieutenant Frederick Freeman. He's at Mare Island, which maybe you don't know where Mare Island is. It's not very far from San Francisco. As the crow flies, it's 25 miles and 35 miles by ship. And he arrives at the ferry building at about 10:30 in the morning, and he has a contingency of all the nurses and physicians that are available for Mare Island, and they're to be disembarked and assist however they may. And he is now asking for, how can I help? And someone tells him, why don't you wait here a bit, and I have to go to Goat Island, which was Yerba Buena Island. And then also Funston tells him to go to Monterey to pick up some more military people. And here he's got these fireboats, and he says, I'm staying here, and I'm going to help in some capacity. So he actually uses this equipment. Remember, there's no water because of the hydrants, and he uses these firefighting boats to suck water out of the estuary or the bay and fight fire along the coastline. And that's why the whole port area was actually saved as a result of his efforts and his 66 men, which his rallying cry, believe it or not, is "sock it to 'em." Now, you probably thought that was invented with laughing, right? But it actually has a longer history. But and for 70 hours, him and his men, cover all parts of the waterfront from the Southern Pacific rail yards to Meigs Wharf, north of where Chinatown is, near Powell Street and such. And these are the flotilla that he's actually utilizing. And so he does this over a 70-hour period, fighting wherever he can, wherever he's needed. And his men are also policing, because not the best upper crust of San Francisco society is hanging out in the waterfront. If there was looting and that kind of mischief, it was in the waterfront. And here is an image which is stitched together. I don't really know exactly where the stitch is and such, but you can clearly see the divide between, and it's taken from the ferry building tower looking north, and you can see this is the waterfront, all protected, in place, and look to the other side of the Embarcadero, which was called East Street, actually. But Freeman saved numerous elements of the waterfront, and San Francisco, if you know a little bit about the history, which I'm sure you do, it really was driven by its ports and rail yards as a transportation hub. That was the vitality of this city, and it was critical that this was actually saved. And so he plays a very prominent role, and to date, I don't think there's any recognition of what Freeman did for the city. There's no plaque, no statue, there's no Funston Street or Freeman Street. There is a Funston Street, but just to kind of tidbit to this, he ends up being dishonorably discharged. He has a drinking problem because he gets discharged of his command from a torpedo boat, and he goes into this Great Depression. And it's not until the 40s that his colleague who was with him here, his name was Pond, he actually petitions FDR, has him pardoned of his dishonorable discharge, but he dies soon after, and he's kind of lone individual, broken man living in Soledad, California, which is a very sad story, but he's a significant individual that contributed in a big way. So the other story I want to say is the Mint, which you may be familiar with. This is on Fifth. The building's still there, so I kind of gave away the end of the story. But the Mint was this, very classical Greek revival architecture, very stout building that did very well in the fire. And here's an image in the morning of day one. You can see the building in the background. There's lots of looky-loos just hanging around, which is kind of unusual because, in fact, as the fire progresses, they have cordoned off places, and you cannot get beyond certain places if you're an individual, a citizen, even if you own the house or they wanted you out of the house. So there was an effort to keep you away from danger. But here, the superintendent of the Mint is Frank Leach, and he's in Oakland, and he wakes up like a lot of people in Oakland, has breakfast, and it's not so bad in Oakland, and he goes around looking about what's happened in Oakland. All the chimneys are down, and he looks over to San Francisco where he's superintendent of this building, and he sees a plume of fire and smoke, and he realizes he has to get over to San Francisco, And he gets over there by ferry, which is difficult because they won't let him on the ferry, but someone vouches for him. And he moves around the fire front and doesn't get to the Mint until late that morning. And who does he find in the building? There's 50 employees that either were there from the night shift, and maybe there were some additional people that were there. And there are 10 military personnel guarding the building, because people came to the building for safety and slept out on its steps that morning. Even though there were fires around, they didn't realize how big they were going to get and how they were going to consume block after block after block. And he arrives, and the building is pretty unique in a number of regards. It has its own water wells, and they had just outfitted the building with its own piping, hydrants, and hoses literally a week before. So they're really ready for this. But just the same, the 50 employees that then recruit the military personnel, there are 60 people in the building, and there's fires all around them. And the fires, particularly on the west side, in the back side of the building, and the north side, were going to be very intense because there was more combustible material. And they describe what it was like in the building, that there were embers and brands of, raining down on the building onto the roof, and it was collecting in drifts in the valley up to 2 feet like hail or snow. And they had hoses of water, and they had to make sure that the roof did not catch on fire. That was below the copper sheeting, but it did catch on fire, and they were constantly fighting it. There were people stationed on each floor, and they had buckets of water, and they were wiping down the casing of the windows because wood will combust at about 500 degrees. And so the windows are actually melting in place because they've gotten so hot. And once the windows are gone, there's plumes of dark smoke billowing into the building. And the building sounds like it's being attacked by artillery because the stones that the building is made out of are superheated, they have moisture in them, and they're explosively spalling off of the building. And it sounds like artillery, and the building is actually quivering. And this is going on all afternoon. And they're in there trying to save this building because there's $300 million in the vault in this building. At one point, they feel that it's a lost cause and they wanted to leave. But in fact, there was really question whether they could actually leave because the fires were so intense outside that they really now were trapped. But they continued to fight, and by 5 o'clock, the quivering and the blasting and the artillery sounds diminished in frequency, and they realized the building is actually cooling down and that they were successful. And now it was their time to go see their families and see how their loved ones were doing. And the building's incredibly important because of the money. The bank, it provided the treasury for the relief funds and banking, so it maintained confidence in the city. And the next slide, shows you the building, and that mottled coloring, that's the spalding of the stone. So it is, in fact, was true what happened because you can see it by that mottled color. And here's another picture that I stumbled across recently. There's the Mint surrounded by devastation, So it really gives you a sense of what they did. The U.S. Post Office, I'm running a little bit behind, so I'm going to maybe pick it up a little bit, but the U.S. Post Office's grand Beaux Arts building completed literally 8 months before the event. And like the other building, the Mint, there are night employees from the evening shift in the building. There's about 10. I've heard different numbers, but about 10. And they, with the use of a couple of fire extinguishers and saturated mail bags, keep the fire out of the building. I mean, some rooms were actually consumed by fire, but minimal. And, they were successful in saving the building. And by Friday, this happens on Wednesday, the first day of the fire, but by Friday, 2 days later, they were ready to send out mail. So here you can see the building. It's still there. It's a courthouse primarily now. And here you can see around the building all the unevenness of the pavement, well, that's clearly liquefaction. It's a process that happens during earthquakes where literally the water-saturated sediment or the foundation turns to liquid, and it can't support the pavement. But by Friday morning, their intent is to notify the refugees in all the camps, because there's probably approaching 60,000 people in refugee camps, and they notify them by commandeering a car, and they put on U.S. mail sign that they commandeered from a cable car on the car, stating more or less that mail will be picked up later today. And the refugees were hysterical in terms of their excitement that, hey, it's getting back to normal. There's something that we recognize here. And by nightfall, 100 pouches are actually collected and mailed, and there's no postage. And you can write your letter on a piece of wrapping paper, newspaper, cardboard, wood, anything. They will take it. So this was an incredible, uplifting thing as to, we have some semblance of what we know. And here's just from Davenport's book, this is one letter that was sent out. Dear Mother, up to now, we are all well and safe. The fire is still burning hard, but in the north part of the city, which would be like North Beach, I won't try to describe anything as it is foolish to begin. There are no words. So people needed to reach out to their loved ones and give them some information as to how they were doing. This is the City Hall, which is the one prior to the one that we have today. And I'll just point out that it was, there's lots of points about this, but it was over $6 million to build, and it didn't do too well. There was more graft than there was cement in the building. It just was a disaster. And in the basement of this building is a central emergency hospital with hundreds of patients. And there was a psychiatric ward in there. So there's a little bit of chaos in there. And they're feeling their way through to get to somewhere of safety. And where do they go? Next door to it is the Mechanics Pavilion, okay, which becomes an impromptu hospital with surgery and everything, and a morgue where people were being collected and people were coming in from south of Market. And Lucy Fisher actually recounts her observations and what she did in this building, and talking about all the patients that were strewn about in this large building, which was really kind of a sporting arena, a political arena. The night before, they had a roller skating event at the building. Unlike Enrico Caruso was at the Mission Opera House for the upper crust, this was more lower crust activities that were at this building, but it was a large pavilion, and she talks about the conditions, and people had to, collect mattresses from hotels, medical supplies from the Central Emergency Hospital or drugstores. So they were looting, quote unquote, for a purpose. And cars were utilized to commandeer all this stuff. Cars were not very common. There were only about 400 or 500 in San Francisco. It became very clear that they weren't just a toy for the upper crust to use, but they were actually a functioning device. And Lucy describes her observations, and there you see, this is the opening, the entrance on Polk. The patients arriving in the upper side, but then they're leaving because by noon of that day, Lucy Fisher, someone whispers her in ear, the roof is on fire. And they have to evacuate all 354 patients. So there's this mad dash to move them elsewhere and such. This is a story about Lu Hing, who is this very wealthy Chinese entrepreneur. I think you can see that he's in the canning business, which is a fairly new thing. And he arrives in 1869, just after the Burlingame Treaty, and he's only 11. And soon after, his brother, who is older, dies, and he is in charge now of the business, and he's 14, but clearly very capable. He learns English. He associates with white intermediaries because they're going to provide him access to selling and buying produce and items, while if he was just a Chinese person, he would not be able to do that. And he opens the Pacific Fruit Canning in 1888 on Stockton Street, sells that and retires to China, but doesn't find, nirvana in China. And he comes back in 1904 and opens up the Pacific Coast Canning in Oakland, which is shown here. This is probably not the original one, but it's a facility, and many of the Chinese refugees, where do they go? Oakland. And there were many in Oakland, and his facility became a sea of tents, and he provided cooking services and food to all these refugees that came there. And he was also co-founder of the Bank of Canton, which was instrumental in the rebuilding of Chinatown too. So here's an entrepreneur who lent out a lending hand. He had money, he had funds and such, and he could do this. So Stetson is this wealthy guy who actually records his wanderings in the city. He lives on Van Ness in a very stately home, and it's incredible in terms of, I just show you where he lives right there. It's at Clay and Van Ness, right there. His house is there. And he's very precise in his observations and such. And what does he do? He goes back to his house, and by 9 o'clock in the morning of day 2, he starts, moving stuff out of his house, because the fire is advancing and moving west, which is towards his location, which is over here, and red is day 2. And so he also, let's see where I am here. So yeah, those are the stars. It's kind of the same thing I was showing you. So this is the house that's across the street from him. This is the Spreckles mansion. Okay, everyone knows Spreckles. The Call building was the newspaper that the Spreckles family owned. And this is the nature of the homes on Van Ness Boulevard. And this is it after it caught fire. That's right at the edge of the fire. You can see Stetson's house is right here. Okay? And he talks at length about how they blew up and burned back all the homes on the east side of Van Ness. Remember day 2? They're much better at using explosives, and they're using them more intelligently, and they're burning back, meaning that they're blowing up buildings way before they're on fire and such. So here's his house, and the house next to him, the Schwabacher house. I'll just cut to the chase here, so to speak, but on Thursday, the second day, he is at his house, protecting it, so to speak, watching what's going on, and he is moved with a military personnel under a rifle and a bayonet to get, vacate the premises, because they were vacating everyone from Van Ness because they're blowing up these buildings and they're fire, and it's literally an inferno. And he marches up to Lafayette Park, which is near there, but within an hour he sneaks back to his house, and he puts his hand on the glass, because there was some glass, because as they were blowing up the buildings across the street, all of his panes, or many of his panes of glass, were shattered, and the walls were cracked and this and that. And the glass is so hot, he can't put his hand on it. And he puts out his hand to the wood. He can feel how hot the wood is. And he stays there just monitoring everything. And he realizes at 10 o'clock in the evening that the Schwabacher house has 2 little fires starting on this cornice, or this tower here. And it's good that he's there, because he says to 3 other people that happen to be there, because there's really no one on the street, he says, I'll give you $10 if you go up and put out that fire. And they did. And it's because of that, he thinks that in fact the whole Western Addition from that point on was somewhat saved. So the point is that there's people who have a vested interest that are there, and he was there to mind it and such. And I'll just point out here that many of these homes, he was very meticulous. In many of these homes, water was turned on 14 days later. You could not have any fires in your home until the flues were checked and the chimneys were checked. And so gas was turned on almost 2 months later, electricity 51 days, and he cooked outdoors for 21 days. But here's where someone actually recorded it all, so it's really pretty impressive. So the next story I want to talk about the Hoadling building, which you may have heard about and such, but it's got a notorious story and such, but it's really very interesting because it really brings together the military, firemen, first responders, employees of Hoadling, hired hands, volunteers. I mean, it's a cadre of different and diverse people that their goal was to save this building. So the goal was to save the building, but they were going to save it because this building is the customs house, which is a block or two, 1 block down from Hoadling Whiskey. And the intent was for the military to blow up the Hoadling Whiskey warehouse if the appraiser or customs house was in danger of catching fire, because it was a government building and such. It was important. Well, Edward Lynn, who is the manager for the Hoadling Whiskey, is down there. He goes to inspect his place of employment, which a lot of people did, along with other Hoadling people. And they're there, and they get wind on Thursday that they're going to potentially blow up the Hoadling building with dynamite, which is not very effective. And he realizes that this could be just a sea of flames. There's 5,000 barrels of whiskey in the warehouse. And so he convinces the military to enable him to come up with a plan. And that plan is to move the 5,000 barrels of whiskey down 2 blocks away into a burned area for safekeeping. So now what does he have to do? He has to hire 80 people that are whiskey barrel rollers, because each barrel is 500 pounds. And where does he get these people? He gets them from the waterfront. And he refers to them as 80 people of a mixed lot. There's a safecracker, there's a chef from a brothel in Chinatown that are on staff with him and such, and they start rolling the whiskey barrels down this cobblestone street to this vacant lot. And they provide ale and stout as kind of sustenance and to keep up morale. And this is all recounted by Edward Lynn. And you can see here, the red area is the area that's actually protected or will be saved. There's Hoadling's Whiskey on Jackson Street. He's got 2 buildings here. And they do this, and they move 1,200 barrels down in the first go. And early that evening of that second day, there's a fire that is burning in this triangular block or gore just west of them. And that building is several stories high. And to fight that fire, which it starts at about 7, is Freeman and his military personnel stretch a 1-mile hose, which you may have heard, over Telegraph Hill to fight the fire on this corner. And it takes them 3 hours to tame that fire. And that building, the whole goal was to keep the building wall that was facing Hoadling Whiskey to fall inward. If it fell outward, all that heat would be exposed and spread maybe across the street. So they were successful in getting that wall to fall inward. And then the following night, they start barrel rolling again, and they, by 12 o'clock or 3 o'clock the next day, they successfully move another 1,000 barrels. And it is so intense, the fire that's on the north side of them now, that there's flames and smoke and ashes billowing around. Some of the hired hands would not go into the Hoadling warehouse for fear that the place would blow up. So they would roll the barrels out to them, and then they would move them down the street. But they finally got to a point that they thought it was hopeless. The fires on the north side were so intense, they just said, we're done. We're going to close up the shop by closing metal shutters, chopping off any wood on the extremity of the building and just hope for the best. And at this time, Freeman tried to fight this fire, but he didn't have the right equipment, connections and such, to reach to this area on the third day, on Friday. So here they are, hoping for the best, but then they started to think, because the winds change, because that's what happens, and the winds change, and it looked like maybe there's an opportunity to do something because it wasn't so intense anymore. So they came up with a plan to tap a sewage line and start a bucket brigade. They lowered a pump into the sewer line, and they had a bucket brigade that provided buckets to the roof of these homes here so that nothing would catch fire. The most significant fire was across the street right here. It was a 3-story building with a French restaurant. The Eiffel Tower restaurant was on top, and they were very concerned about the fire, they were concerned about the fire leaping across, and so on that corner building, they were going up into the attic, up a rickety staircase, and dumping the sludge on any woodwork so that it wouldn't catch fire, and making sure any fires that started. While they were going up in this very tight spaces, Ed Lynn was in the midst of all this, and Ed Lynn has a bucket of sludge fall on his head. And he says it was horrible. One side of Jackson was a roaring fury of flames with walls toppling and smoke choking people. The evil-smelling sludge or stuff made a steam that was suffocating as it evaporated on the roasting woodwork. I mean, it must have been very intense. And this went on for a couple of days. And they saved the building because you can see the north side of Jackson doesn't look too good. And the Hodling warehouse is right here. Okay? And we know the story about the little ditty that was actually penned by Charles Kellogg, you may know, or Charles Field, sorry. You know, invariably, whenever there's a disaster like this, some minister will say this was the wrath of God, and, you know, San Francisco deserved it. And so this was penned by Charles Field. If, as they say, God spanked the town for being overly frisky, why did he burn the churches down and save Hodling's? So this was used as an advertisement for Hodling's whiskey, because they still had an ample supply. So moving along, I have about another 10 minutes, okay? Thank you for all your attention, but there's so many fascinating stories, and they're really pretty impressive. We're going to go more towards the San Francisco citizenry and how did they behave, and there's many firsthand accounts and quotes and such. These 2 quotes at the top, one is an anonymous woman in the book by Fratkin, and the one below is by Jack London. The bottom line is there was this deafening silence. Everyone was incredibly cooperative, okay? While traversing the city those 3 days and nights, I saw no tears, heard not one loud word, and the utter calmness of man, woman, and child was marvelous. Whether the apathy of despair or a dazed condition from terror or the undaunted spirit that cannot give up, it was something never to be forgotten. This is repeated over and over and over, because there's thousands of refugees moving through the city, and they're very pleasant to one another. And Jack London says, never in all of San Francisco's history were people so kind and courteous as this night of terror, you know. And so the perspective of Solnit, who wrote this great book, 2009, on Paradise and Hell, and she uses San Francisco earthquake and fire and a number of other tragedies to kind of exemplify what she believes, but the authorities' fear was not precipitated by anything the public did in those days, but by earlier anxieties. They believed uncontrolled crowds routinely degenerate into mobs. The point is that she's saying that in other pages, not so much there, but she says that, you know, because of the disaster, this humanity that we all contain in our inner self really bubbles to the surface. And what used to be a hierarchical society, very much San Francisco and very much now, really flattens out, and everyone becomes much more humane and more generous in whatever they have. And that persisted for a month. It went back, but her book is fabulous in this regard. And what I was going to just showcase here is just a couple of individuals that stepped up and did something about the plight and the tragedy that many refugees felt. And this is Anna Amelia Holhauser, and she ends up in Golden Gate Park. But she's a hairstylist, a masseuse, and she moves along with all the other refugees because her place of business is devastated, and her home is not in great shape, and she moves west with all the refugees because there's aftershocks, and you don't want to be, near buildings, and you want to be in open spaces and such. And she stitches together, within days of getting there, this enormous fabric that is utilized as a tent for setting up a communal kitchen that she grows into feeding 200 and 300 people a day, and it was referred to as the Palace Hotel. Someone, put up a sign for it, but there were other kitchens that actually sprouted up, and I just have 2 or 3 here that I mentioned, but there were many more. The point is that this humanity was spilling out of people, and everyone had this solidarity and empathy for one another, and it showed through. This is the House of Mirth. I happened to find a picture of it, but and there are comical signs, there's elevator service and this and that. They really made light of things whenever they could. Obviously, there were people who were in dire shape that lost their loved ones and such, but there are other stories to be told. And then this is the oyster loaf, which I'm impressed with how well they look, the women. They probably didn't go out unless they were all fixed up, but they had the capacity to do that, and they provided food to people. I'll just mention the Schmidt family, the kitchen in Dolores, near Dolores Park. I don't know if you recall, but on looking at the map, but Dolores was the dividing line, just like Van Ness was. Dolores was a dividing line between unburned and burned, and they were in that neighborhood. He's down in the wholesale district, which is not far from here, as a patrolman, a policeman, and I don't know why, but he leaves and goes home. Maybe his shift is off, I don't know, but in the morning he actually retrieves a couple of dead bodies and he recounts them. He also is involved in dealing with the herd of cattle that are running rampant and free down Mission Street, and they're actually shooting them because they don't want cattle running through the city. And one of them actually gets away and careens through the city and ends up in Portsmouth Square, or at least running by Portsmouth Square. And in Chinese mythology, the end of the earth, Armageddon, is going to be told to us by a loose cow running through the city. So it's pretty impressive that he does all this and then goes home, and they start by feeding and seeking out destitute people and delivering food to them, his family. Initially, they deliver meals to people, and then eventually they establish a centralized communal kitchen. And because they're doing this, the dairymen who are coming up from the peninsula with milk and such are dropping off food supplies to them at this location. Wholesale butchers are dropping off hunks of meat so that they can actually prepare stews and such for the community, because there was a lot of cooking out on the street. And the Red Cross provided supplies, so it was this dissemination. It wasn't just the Red Cross and the military that were providing these services. So, one more here. So these are 2 businesses. Tom Burns actually was had a produce firm in the wholesale district, and he came back and got 50 crates of oranges and distributed them in the Panhandle, which is where he lived. He subsequently, I don't know exactly where he got the subsequent produce, but for 7 days or 3 weeks, he is providing produce from somewhere that he has access to and disseminating it. His home is also free of fire, and it becomes a place where guests and refugees from who knows where, they're camping out at his house, and he's welcoming them. Some he knows, some he don't, and for whatever reason, he has water running in his house. So it's the eternal spring, and people are coming from the neighborhood with buckets to fill at his house, and his house is open to everybody. And Charles Reddy, who's the manager of the Miller and Lux Slaughterhouse, I don't know if you know, there's a restaurant, Miller and Lux, I didn't know that, at Chase, and they're somehow affiliated with this family or this business that was in business in the 1800s and was a very large landowner. But on day one, they dispense all butchered meat to whoever asked and no cost. And clearly the meat would have spoiled, but they actually hired additional people to dispense of all this meat that they had. And the supplies consisted of, I mean, my goodness, 300 cattle, but all these supplies lasted just 7 days. And you have to say, why? Why did they do this? Well, going back to SoulKnit is this sense of solidarity, empathy, they're all in the same thing. And she made another point, there are no long-term plans. All the plans that you have and you perceive for retirement and this and that, they all kind of go away and they really dissolve and they become not very important. And people think and only are concerned about the immediate demands of survival. So it's a paradise in hell is really what it is, and that's the title of her book. So that's kind of the end of the selection of heroes that I cobbled together. There are many more, but clearly it was a tough time, but people don't descend into anarchy. People do pull together and they do help one another and they rise to the occasion when allowed to, because there are many times where people were held at bay not to participate, but just like in the hodling where different forces of people pulled together, they were successful. And the thesis is that had that been done a little bit more openly and we didn't have this Funston perspective, the city might have endured a little bit more. So thank you very much for your attention and your time. I appreciate listening to me. And
you stay there, Jack?
Any questions?
You're going to sit there?
Yeah.
I'll take care of it. Okay. All right. The setup from here on in is that you raise your hand. I'll either nod and say I see, but I got this person first or whatever else, but that's my role. And you're scratching your head or you're the first person who's going to ask a question. So
that's Dan or?
You got to wait for the microphone, that's all. You ready? On the far side.
Jack, I can't help but ask, because you're a New Yorker, do you think the same phenomena was at work in New York on 9/11?
I can't talk extemporaneously as knowledgeable, but Rebecca Solnit's book has a chapter. There's Katrina and there's 9/11 in New York. So the similar traits and outpouring of empathy was relevant there too. And I can't talk specifically about it, but it's most definitely there. I think it's a universal thing. It's just sad that we don't have this humanity that is on the surface all the time. So,
I need it.
Question.
And then up here, you're next. You'll be after the person in the back.
Thanks, Jack, for a great presentation. Didn't we see the same thing in 1989 for Loma Prieta?
Yes. So did we see the same thing in 89? And I do a talk for City Guides on 89, and one of the slides is showing people at the Cypress Expressway, the double-decker that collapsed, and they're, literally standing on each other's shoulder to get up to the road deck to extract people. And then there's another image of a bunch of youngsters in the Marina District, because that's where there was a major fire, hauling a fire hose down the road to the fire front. So yes, I'm sure that the same empathy occurred during Loma Prieta.
Jack, the electricity. I was struck by you talking about the mint, and there was a reservoir of water, and did they still have electricity too? And how widespread was the electricity at the time?
Well, so the question was regarding the mint, and the the pumps that they use for their water wells and such, they had a boiler that had to be repaired, and their source of energy was from there. Electricity, I don't know the extent of it, but I suspect it was quite extensive, that there was electricity available, but it was damaged as a result of the earthquake and such. But in the mint, they actually had a boiler to actually, and they were repairing it frantically to get it back up and running. So,
Hi. What did the bankers do during the crisis? Like Crocker and Giannini, were they handing out dollar bills from their bank vaults?
well, a quick little story. I mean, the bankers typically lived on Nob Hill, and it was easy for them to get down to their place of employment or their business, and they inspected everything, and they went early, and their first reaction, because the fires were dispersed and such, they put whatever important documents into the vault, okay? Giannini, a Bank of Italy, was a small-time banker. He lives not on Nob Hill, he lives down in San Mateo. He comes up by afternoon, and the place is totally devastation now in terms of fire and such. It's a firestorm. But he's of Italian heritage, and he has family members who have horse-drawn carts, and he takes a different position because he's got a different boundary perspective, and he has only $80,000 in his bank, and he takes that and all his important documents, puts them on a horse-drawn cart, and under nightfall goes down back to San Mateo with some orange crates on it and this and that. And he comes back Monday morning because none of the banks could open, because they knew from the Chicago fires that, in fact, if you open this vault, which you could open, but the superheated air that would come in would cause things to combust if you had any paper in there. So the banks were really closed for close to a month. Giannini set up 2 barrels and a door and started loaning out money on Monday morning. He had $80,000 and it was loaned out to North Beach customers on a handshake. So, and North Beach is probably the district in the city that rebuilt the quickest, and probably as a result of his being there and having access to that money.
Question down front, Chris?
Yep.
I'm just wondering if the owner of the whiskey company ever thanked that gentleman who saved everything. He was only the manager, he wasn't the owner.
He was the cashier and manager, and he wasn't the owner, but he was dedicated, obviously. And I don't know that part, whether he did anything, but you know, a lot of these recollections are actually done immediately, like Stetson, and they're very, you know, very clear, and some are done 10 years later. So there has to be some memory loss and this and that, but I don't know what they did. But hodling whiskey and the 2 blocks of Jackson Square survived, you know. But yeah, it's amazing, you know, to think of just a cashier, man. The dedication is tremendous, just like the dedication of those people that were in the mint. Yeah, so it's, you know, it's something to be admirable about and think well of.
Let me add a couple of things. One is that the press out of San Francisco, starting with Oakland, did a doom and gloom. It was really, really serious. The Oakland newspaper really was horrible. It exaggerated deaths, it exaggerated damage, and pretty soon it came down. But that same piece of information got on the wires, and everybody wanted to cover the doom and gloom story.
Right.
And it took a while before the San Francisco press started putting out the real story, which Jack is telling us, which is very common.
There were some national newspapers that had, you know, doctored photographs of buildings just toppling over. The mechanics pavilion, the 354 patients, it was reported nationally that all of those 354 patients were either shot or killed with chloroform, which, because the building caught fire and they didn't want any of them to be burned alive, but in fact, they were all vacated and such. But this occurs again in Katrina with that hospital where, remember, the elderly and their generator goes out and such, and I think they euthanize the people in the building. So these are very tragic times and such, but sometimes they get sensationalized in the press.
The sensationalized press also was big on cutting off fingers to get a raise.
Oh, yeah.
That seemed to always be the hot story,
Yeah.
you know. And most of it is apocryphal. It's lies, but
Right.
we know how the press has to sell papers. Doesn't change.
Any other ones?
Over here, Chris, right down.
Could you tell us, when did you start doing all this history?
Repeat.
Was it when you first came to San Francisco? And when do you do your tours?
So when did I start doing all this research and such? And I retired in 2014, and I graduated from City Guides training to do walking tours the month I retired. So I've been doing it since I retired, which is now 10 years or so. And I do the San Francisco 1906 earthquake and fire for City Guides. I do the earthquake and fire tour here, but with an emphasis on Chinatown. And I also do the Golden Gate Bridge tour. But, you know, it's just a way to volunteer and also get something in return, because I like history and I like being on stage. So, you know. And I like just meeting, because we meet people
Chris.
from all over, internationally and such. So.
Let me tell you, many people who I've known, Chris down front, who have gone through the training of City Guides, have
David,
always been very, very
I think that-
laudatory of what they do in terms of the training, and they really, you know, teach you how to command an audience, and then you have to come up with your own project. And so there's many of them come up with some unique projects, and so City Guides does an excellent job, and we're trying to do just a little bit of that working out of this building. So.
Jack, that was a great presentation, and City Guides is certainly proud of you. I'm curious about the rebuilding. You talked about no insurance, and where did the money come from to rebuild, and sort of how long did that take?
Well, how long did it take to rebuild? Where did the money come from? Well, obviously there were insurance companies. The city was inundated by adjusters. They were looking for photographs of homes that were maybe damaged before they were consumed by fire. Some insurance companies paid dollar on a dollar. Some didn't. There was lots of money that poured into San Francisco. Japan gave it was $250,000 or $500,000. So money poured into the city in terms of to rebuild and such. And the city virtually rebuilds by 1910. It's just incredible. I mean, if you're a horse lover, I think over 2,000 horses were worked to death in order to rebuild the city. It's just, a friend of mine actually, his family is in Australia. He actually lived in Australia, but he told me a story about his grandfather receiving a flyer from San Francisco or California looking for artisans, you know, bricklayers, carpenters and such, that they were recruiting from Australia. San Francisco realized that if they didn't rebuild, they would lose population, just like Katrina, because New Orleans still is not back to its population. So San Francisco knew, and they had this ability to rebuild, and within 3 years it's rebuilt. And in 1915, but in 1911, 1912, they're awarded the privilege of hosting the Panama Pacific International Exposition, which is kind of a debutante party for the city. So there was a big drive, and the city raised lots of funds, and the city was appointed by the federal government to host it. So there was a tremendous drive to demonstrate that they are back in business, you know, very quick, very quick.
Question down front, Chris.
I don't think that could be done nowadays.
No.
There's too many people at the table.
Thank you. Yeah, April 18th, 5 a.m. Are you
Yes,
going to be at
5
Lotus Fountain?
512.
What's that?
512,
Yeah.
sorry. Are you going to be at Lotus Fountain this year?
Oh, I have never been at Lotus Fountain, but, you know, I probably should go.
It's fun.
Yeah, have you been? Yeah. Yeah, they even have water running on the fountain for about a week. Because whenever I go by there for my tours, there's always water running after that. But people come in period clothing, and then they go to the golden hydrant and they paint it. So I should go. I haven't been. So yes. I've
It's
seen
a big
images.
dress-up event for many people.
I don't know if I
look
have
forward to
that
it
kind
every
of
year.
attire though.
Yeah. What one just a footnote to what Jack is talking about is people were in long lines getting food, particularly in the beginning, and there's some wonderful anecdotal stories about the fact that Mrs. O'Brien was talking to Mrs. Schwartz, and they had nothing in common until they stood in line and they exchanged their stories and all that kind of stuff. Or so we have a wealthy woman and definitely a working class person neck with each other, being human, and that was the story. There's many of those. I'm just picking one. So.
And the number of marriage licenses increased immensely after this.
Right.
event.
We have it coming.
I have one little story. When I was in
Sure.
junior high, I had to write a big paper on the earthquake and fire. Now, my elderly aunt had been a 12-year-old girl in 1906 in Arkansas, and she had a little friend who lived in San Francisco. And she wrote her a letter after the, after everything. And my aunt saved that.
Wow.
And
great.
she told a lot of things about getting food. But the one story was there was this man who had two families. He had one out in the Mission, and he had one
Womanizer.
closer to the Richmond district, which didn't really exist. And he showed up at Golden Gate Park looking for God knows who. But both of those women happened to be there with the children, and they spotted him at pretty much the same time.
Oh,
And ran, oh, there's my husband. No, that's my husband. No, and she said it took 6 cops to pull those women off of him.
the truth always
The
comes out.
truth always comes out.
Yeah.
But that was,
That's
she,
great.
she had a lot of funny things in the letter.
Yeah. Great. Thank you for sharing that.
The microphone is moving. We've got one more time for one more. Oh, wait, do we have anything on? No. Okay. So we have a question way in the back.
I worked at the Big Four restaurant in the Huntington Hotel up on Nob Hill for 24 years.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite customers was Chrissy Martenstein, and she always said I was her favorite waiter. In 2006, she was 100 years old, and she was the big deal at Lotta's Fountain. The fire department picked her up at the towers and drove her to Lotta's Fountain. But in 1906, she was 9 years old. She was a 9-year-old girl. She and her family slept on the sidewalk at Van Essen Market, where their home was, because they were afraid of aftershocks.
Sure.
And Chrissy never left San Francisco. She lived in the city until she passed away at 109 years old.
Wow.
So she saw the rebuilding of the city, the PPIE, the World War I, the doughboys going out, the doughboys coming back, the building of the bridges, World War II, the GIs going out, GIs coming back. The Summer of Love. I mean, what that woman saw in her
She
lifetime,
saw it all. Yes.
it's just amazing.
Well, it's an impressive city to be looking after. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, with that, we are going to close tonight's meeting. I think it's one of our best meetings in a long time, and we continue to try to have the quality that Jack brings to the topic.
Thank you.
And the presentation.
Thanks a lot.